So, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining the session, which is really asking the question, is this the year of the CDO, the Chief Data Officer? And I'm joined by some wonderful panelists. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in order, but I'll start with Enrico and move on to Kevin and Jose and then Saeed, and I'll introduce myself at the end. So Enrico, could you give us a minute or two on yourself and your background and also your interest in data?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Yes, I am Enrico Camerinelli. I'm dialing from Italy, and I'm the non-executive board member of Supply at Me. Supply at Me is an inventory monetization platform. Basically, we turn inventory into digital assets that can be traded. And so this allows companies to offset the inventory value from their balance sheet. So the interest on data is quite significant because we have to turn physical assets into digital data, and therefore the management of data and the constant correlation between physical assets and digital assets is extremely important for us.
Thanks, Enrico. Very useful. Kevin.
Hello, everyone. My name's Kevin Kindall. I'm joining from Houston, Texas. I'm a senior data scientist with Hartree Partners. We're a commodities trading shop based in New York. We trade energy and softs and so on. And my interest in data is because without data, I would not have, I couldn't do my job. I do work on a lot of valuation problems. I work on risk management problems. I do occasionally fundamentals forecasting and so on. And all that's very, very data intensive.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Definitely going to find out more about some of the stuff you do and opinions later on. Looking forward to it. Jose.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jose Lopez. I'm the Digital Strategy Director at TradeFlow Capital Management. We're a fund management company that invests in SME bulk commodity trading, and we do small trades up to $15 million. Therefore, we don't compete with banks, or more likely we collaborate with them. And what it makes it special is that we do not lend money. We enable the trade by owning the commodity and managing the logistics. Therefore, for us, data is key. Our fund has a fantastic record of over 3.5 years. We do trades globally. We're based in Singapore. I'm actually participating in this panel from Singapore. We're very techy. I like to say that we digitize as much as we can, and we use a lot of data, artificial intelligence, IoT of things with the objective of becoming efficiency and scalable. The mission of TradeFlow Capital is to help to reduce the gigantic gap of 1.5 trillion that exists in trade finance between the SMEs and the financiers. And for this purpose, we have partnered up with ICC, with the International Chamber of Commerce, to help to reduce this gap. It's an honor to be here in this panel.
Thank you very much, Jose. That's really useful. I look forward to hearing more about it. Saeed.
Well, first of all, thanks for the invite. So I'm the founder of Cuemacro. So it's a quantitative consultancy firm developing trading strategies and analytics primarily for macro markets. So it's in particular currencies, but also we've done a lot of work on commodities as well. I was going to say, I guess like Kevin, my interest in data is because it's a key part of what I do. So sometimes it can be forecasting currency moves. Other times it just might be trying to create indicators as well. And I've also co-written the book of Alternative Data, a guide for investors, traders, and risk managers, looking at all sorts of unusual data sets and how they can be monetized from a trading perspective as well.
That is fantastic. I want to dig into that a bit later. So thanks very much, Saeed, particularly on some of the subjects around monetization and stuff. So great panel. I feel honored to be kind of chairing this panel, and I'm the CEO and founder of Digiterre. We build both front office and middle office systems for organizations in the space, but also a lot of data architecture. So clients come to us to try and understand how to build an architecture that supports trading applications across the enterprise. So data to us is core to what we do and fascinating for me personally. So without further ado, let us roll on. I guess my first question for the panel is, what is the distinction between the role of a CDO, which, on the face of it makes sense, Chief Data Officer, and that of a CIO, which is a Chief Information Officer, when we're trying to make sure that the data gives us information rather than just is data, versus a CTO, versus a COO, perhaps that's easier, and finally a Chief digital officer. So I'd love to hear from each member of the panel, like what's your view on the distinctions between the two and some of the sort of pros and cons of such a role? Enrico.
Yes, let's see. I've taken notes here of all these different acronyms. So let's start with the. So the C, so the chief is not because these people necessarily have to be heading among huge sort of groups of employees, but it's rather the responsibility they have towards the company. So from my understanding, from my research also, my daily job is doing market research, market analysis. The chief data officer is basically the one responsible to turning raw data into information. And so it's providing then the how could I say, the raw material, which in this case is information, to the chief information officer. So the chief information officer basically takes the information that is extracted from the raw data from the CDO, and then basically helps the company understand what kind of information is useful, how should be managed, what should be updated, what should be removed. So the CIO is then the one who basically feeds the CTO, because in order to manage this information in a proper way, you need to have a sound technology infrastructure. And also the CTO, so the Chief Technology Officer, is the one who has to must make possible the data extraction, which is part of the CDO's responsibility, but also how to manage the data that is turned into information across the company. So once the CDO, CIO, and CTO are all aligned and have sort of fulfilled their tasks, the COO, the Chief Operation Officer, can actually establish how to run the operations, how to do it in the most efficient way, because he or she has all the necessary information and has the system in place to extract information and manage it at the best way possible. And finally, the Chief Digital Officer, I would say, is at the service of all these individuals. So, at the end of the day, of course, you can do these things manually, but the best way to do it is to automate and have a digital access and digital sharing. And so I would say that the Chief Data Officer, the Information Officer, the Operations Officer, and who else did I forget? The Technology Officer. They are basically all the internal clients of the Digital Officer.
That's really interesting and very comprehensive. So to summarize, you're saying effectively the CDO's role is around raw data. The CIO's is turning that into usable information to run the organization. And the CTO is, in a sense, building some of the capabilities to get the data, leverage the data, surface the data. Is that it? And then the chief digital person is a customer of that information. Is that a fair summary?
I would say it's no. The digital officer, I would say, is the provider of.
Okay.
So it's at the service of all the others, because that would be my opinion.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's very comprehensive. Kevin, what are your thoughts as a non-gambling man?
As keeping things simple, when I think of a chief data officer, I think in the context of physical trading. So the focus of the chief data officer ought to be on the data, on utilizing the data as an asset and coming up with various governance policies. So if you look at a typical trading desk, you have price data and so on, but you also have a tremendous amount of fundamental data that's extremely specific to that particular market. So there's a lot of specialness. So for those of you who do physical trading, you understand this. There is sometimes information, sometimes it's quite obscure, but it's very, very useful for decision making, and gives you some sort of has some sort of forecasting value. And the challenge for a CDO is when he looks at a large organization, he has to understand the business well enough to know that certain types of data is very valuable. There's a timeliness aspect to it. There's it has to be in a useful form. For some desks, they may have programmers, they're very comfortable with relational databases or data lakes. For other desks, they largely run off Excel. But whatever the platform they're using, the chief data officer is focusing on the data, how it's utilized, why it's important, and so on. When we get into these other roles, you focus more on the IT platform, the delivery mechanisms and such.
Okay, good. Thank you. Very succinct. Nice, clear dividing line. Thanks very much, Kevin. Jose, what are your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, well, I fully agree on both panels. I would say, I will just remark, Enrico's definition would be 99% when it comes to a gigantic organization that have the luxury of having every single C-suite possible available, right? Which is not always the case. There's always, it happens to be an overlapping between who is the digital officer, who is information officer, who is, and so on. So reality of things is that they do overlap depending on the size of the organization. I don't see particularly in my organization that we could have 4 different specialists and moreover is the same person with different hats. So there's a clear overlapping for that. And to the very good point from Kevin on the data and the raw data and so on, I do think that from a macro perspective, what is critical is that data is raw. It's absolutely valueless without bringing it to before transforming it into an information. And I would like to remind that that information is only valid at a specific time. If it's not ready, if it's not available, or it's still not raw, or it doesn't fall into the hands of the right person, that information is meaningless, right? So I support my both fair panelist definitions. I think they're great.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jose. Saeed, what are your thoughts? Perhaps bringing you also your experience with alternative data sources here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess a lot of what I'm going to say is probably going to sound familiar, given some of the previous remarks. But the way that I would look definitely as a CDO, again, would say definitely as somebody who's responsible for moving the raw data in some sort of structured form, which is usable by the rest of the organization. But I would say the CDO obviously needs to have a lot of people reporting to them, maybe data strategists to find the data, data scientists to crunch the data as well. And at the same point, bringing to mind Kevin's point that the other roles are, I would say, very much kind of to support the process. So you need to have a good tech stack, and the CTO, for example, will be responsible for that as well. So it's very much a team oriented play. But I would also agree that maybe all these types of roles are going to be more for big organizations. In a smaller firm, you can't really justify having so many of these roles. But it's key, I would say, to have a chief data officer to kind of drive change within an organization.
Great, thank you. So we've got reasonable consistency across the piece. Fantastic. So moving to the next question around, okay, maturity. So I've heard this a lot around our industry, is people thinking that our industry is not as mature as some industries might be, maybe financial markets or even the tech industries, around the use of data, the gathering of data. So what can we learn from other industries with respect to, and them being further up the maturity curve? Enrico, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, part of most of my activity is working with financial institutions, but I do have a supply chain management background as well. So I would say, going back into my supply chain days, I would say data in that aspect. So supply chain management is not to be confused only with logistics. So it's not only moving goods from one place to the other. There's also planning, is understanding how to do it, when to do it, how much to hold. Especially these days, we've seen actually these years now with the pandemic, how the full planning and logistics are important. And so in the supply chain world, data is very much used, especially in the negotiation phase with suppliers, as well as in establishing, for instance, price schemes, or establishing, networking, logistics networking policies. Because the more data you have, the more you can appreciate where to position your manufacturing establishments, how to service clients, and so on. And also how to decide production, whether you want to have make to stock, so basically producing based on forecast or producing on demand. Moving into the financial world, the use of data is even more robust and more important. I'm covering a part of finance which is more related to commercial banking, but the most advanced that I see is on the retail side, consumer. So we see now in the sprouting of these technologies called APIs, so application programming interfaces, that basically allow to capture the information or the preferences of the customer, and then providing services or advising about services and opportunities based on the data is collected, based on permission, of course, of the customer. So I would say my best advice, if anybody asks me one, is not necessarily to look what's happening in your specific sector, but look at what's happening in other sectors, and then try to turn those experiences and best practices into something that can be applicable to your own.
Good, I get that point. And so you're effectively saying there are different almost use cases and levels of data maturity, but that's partly driven by need. Logistics and stuff like that. So it's not that we're necessarily less mature, but there are things we can learn from other industries, which makes sense. So thank you very much, Enrico. Kevin, what are your thoughts on this, particularly with respect to the gambling industry, which fascinates me?
Well, there's a lot of things that that come to mind when we talk about this. And, in my view, I've been in this business for a while, and it always seems that the energy business, particularly the physical trading, seems to be a perpetually emerging market. It seems that we never seem to adopt the latest technologies. It seems like we're always seem to use the same old tools. When I think of the data, I think of several different types of data. You have trade data, you've got price data, and even today, price discovery can be a bit of a challenge. And then, as I mentioned before, you have this large amount of fundamental data, where you have supply and demand and logistics. And, even like when you talk about price data, for the physical markets, a lot of this is still supplied by brokers. So, there's not, from the physical side, most of that's not listed market. You don't have a settlement committee or a settlement or an algorithm at an exchange that's providing a daily settlement price. And so a lot of this will come from brokers. And, many times they will send this out either as in an email or a PDF document attached to that email or an Excel spreadsheet. And you look at this and you say, well, surely there's a better way to disseminate price data. It's something that's more secure and more auditable. And yes, indeed there is, but there's no incentive on the part of the broker community to do so. It is almost as if someone has to come up with a solution and essentially give it away for free.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. But
and, are there industries you can draw upon that you think do this better?
Well, you can look at the data intensive industries like Amazon. They do a lot of customer profiling. When I go shop on Amazon and click on something but don't buy it, it's not uncommon, to see advertisements for that going forward. And of course, you have the casino business does an excellent job customer profiling. They monitor loss rates and so on real time. So there's a timeless aspect to that. And in their business, it's very interesting because they all have the same games. And how do you attract people to your casino? In the old days, it was they would build a bigger building. They'd build the casino in the shape of a pyramid or something like that. But that became cost prohibitive, and your internal rates of return start to go down. And so rather than doing something bigger and better, you have to run a much smarter operation.
Got it. Yeah, we touched on this earlier. I think it's brilliant. So you're really talking about tying the supplier to customer data much tighter, in a tighter way than we do perhaps in our industry right now. Amazon does it brilliantly. I didn't realize gambling did it quite so well, but clearly they do. Yeah. Yes. Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. Jose, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the example of the casinos and client profiling is probably the best of the best examples. But I would look to the gurus. In my opinion, if you're talking about data, you need to look at Google, you need to look at Facebook, you need to look at Visa, you need to look at PayPal. All these guys, even Apple. They know. I think they know you better than we know ourselves. They know exactly how much you're going to spend, what are you going to buy, when are you going to spend it, when can you go over the limit. And that might be a little bit more related to payments, but at the very end, what they are doing is collecting raw data, absolutely raw data. How many websites so you clean, how many times you do payments with your card, how many times you check your computer, and so on, and define a pattern. So if I have to choose which industry would I follow? I would say the tech companies are the ones that are actually leading the path of data analysis and creation of valuable information, which is the ultimate objective.
Yeah, cool. And I think that this interesting point, the creation of valuable information that they then act on is critical. I would suggest that a lot of our participants to this event and others are in companies that have seas of data. It's just turning that sea of data into valuable information that you can action, perhaps in a more automated way, might be the challenge. But thank you very much, Jose.
That, Ian, take us to the point where what Kevin was mentioning. At the very end, the suppliers of informations and platforms where traders can actually go and collect the information, they're limited. It's the same guys for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's complicated to get information. That's why I think we need to learn from the masters of data analysis.
Great, thank you, Jose. Saeed, what are your thoughts on this? Particularly, again, I'd love your alternative data viewpoint on this.
Sure. Well, I guess my experience is mostly from financial markets. So I've worked in banks, also done projects with quant funds. On the one hand, we're obviously quite mature in this space in terms of utilization data. And then also for commodity trading houses where typically the use of data is not quite at the same level as a large quant fund. I think the key point is trying to do what you can. So it's not a case of jumping towards the most complicated machine learning model from the start. Just going on to Kevin's point about price data being in kind of unstructured forms like a spreadsheet, etc. So that's a good place to start. All the data in terms of price data, try and capture that as best you can and put it into a structured form like a database. And once you have the data in a structured form, then you can start playing around with it and utilizing it, and just take small steps to begin with. Sometimes people want the most complicated model, but usually the simplest thing is actually a good start and potentially could be quite useful. And that's the same, I'd say, for alternative data. Don't necessarily spend months and months on a project. Try and maybe start with a structured alternative data set to begin to kick your process off, I'd say.
So iteratively, effectively, mine the seam iteratively and see what value you can get, surface that value.
I think so. Yeah, definitely. Okay. I would agree with that, because ultimately, and that's the way you get buy-in as well.
Cool. Yeah, that all makes sense, because you're right that there are organizations which are groups of people with different stakeholders, all having different views and opinions and needs to try and satisfy with the data you're using. So a question for you then, I'm going to change the order a bit. This one I'm going to ask you directly is, what are the steps then from taking us from raw data, which if I summarize the views of all of you, the CDO is more to do with the raw data and the CIO is more to do with the interpretation and value add to that data. So what are the steps to going from raw data to decision making, i.e. information?
I'd flip it the other way around, actually. So I would say, what are your use cases? So if my use case is I want to forecast a certain commodity price, I want to try and get more insight in a specific market, go from there and then slowly narrow down into the sorts of data sets that are going to be useful. Hopefully those data sets are things that you collect yourself, or if they're not, then there's something that you can obtain externally. So once you go from your use cases, then you can narrow down and identify what sorts of data sets. And then once you have the data sets, then you need to structure the data sets, create models around them, and go back towards your use case, essentially.
Brilliant. So make it very problem focused and solve problems and surface the data, or find the data to solve the problems.
I would definitely, because at least whenever I've looked at data sets, when you try and get a massive data and you try and find something, just invariably you don't find it.
Need on a haystack. Yeah,
exactly. So at least if you can shine a spotlight on the right side sorts of data and potentially the right variables to look at, I think that could be quite helpful for you. And the thing is, a lot of people in the industry experience, they might not be tech folks, but they kind of have a feeling of what drives markets. So they're the first people I would say to ask. It's not, to begin with, it's more of a markets problem as opposed to a data science problem. It becomes a data science problem later on, once the question has been asked, I'd say.
Could you expand on that bit, for example? What do you mean by that? It becomes data science later on?
Because I would say the perspective of somebody who likes data, including myself, is to try and find something in the data. And typically you might end up data mining some sort of solution. Whilst if you have some sort of guidance from a domain expert, then they can kind of guide you in such a way that you'll hopefully avoid kind of more spurious solutions within the data. So it's not a case of just trying to data mine a solution, it's trying to find something which they think can work and then verify it and go backwards from that.
Okay, so almost form a hypothesis and then validate it or not through the data.
Yeah, it's kind of more the traditional statistics. And I think particularly in these types of areas like markets, the signal to noise ratio is very low.
Yeah.
So potentially it's more amenable to that. I guess in other industries, you can do a bit more data mining because you have so much more data. But at least within financial markets and kind of energy trading, the signal, you just need a signal that works 51% of the time, and that's good enough.
That's good enough. Exactly. Brilliant. Very insightful. Thank you, Saeed. Jose, any thoughts from you on that question of affecting how you move from raw data?
I was actually thinking, while Saeed was speaking, I would say there's a human factor we're not taking in account when you want to develop. What are the steps, from the raw data, to valuable information? There's definitely a human factor, the person who has experience. I was thinking in the case of TradeFlow. TradeFlow is, you can say we're digital, we use artificial intelligence and so on. First, you locate what is the problem, what you're trying to solve, and Saeed was explaining beautifully. And but there's a big component of the experts, this intangible information that the experts actually bring onto the table. And then you start building what you need, which platform, which systems are you going to use in order to get to that information or to convert it. So my 2 cents to the discussion would be, let's not forget the experts in that they bring some intangible value that actually is very valuable.
Yeah, so I guess picking up on that same point as Saeed, the domain knowledge around that data is probably invaluable. Otherwise, it's just a sea of data points without any surfaced value and information. So thank you very much. Yeah, cool. Jose, thank you. Kevin, you must have a view on this one.
I do.
I thought so.
I very much agree with the other panelists. So what I'm going to say is basically the same thing in different words. So a lot of the requests for data come directly from the front office. So these are traders or desk heads that understand their business very, very well. And they're looking for data that, if they had it, would allow them to make better decisions. And many times it doesn't have to be numerically correct. It can just be directionally correct. And so they're looking for things that give them that competitive edge. And because the data itself gives them a competitive edge, it's very much proprietary and has to be closely held.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So effectively, you're building on the same point, but your point is anything that's truly valuable from a market perspective has to be closely held, which kind of makes sense. Keep the secret sauce close.
Right. I mean, we all, generally speaking, have the same tools and so on. And so if you're looking for something that that allows you to make better trades than your competitors, many times it does come down to the data.
And are there any insights from your side as to how that comes about? What creates more secret sauce than others, I suppose, in that question around moving from raw data decision making? Are there any obvious steps you see people making who are very good at that versus those who are less good at it?
I mean, a lot of it comes down to the specialness of these physical markets. If you have a trader that's been doing this for 15 or 20 years, he or she can remember all sorts of events that have happened and how the markets respond. And just being on a desk, you slowly pick up and accumulate that commercial knowledge. And as your commercial knowledge starts to expand, you start to realize that, hey, well, maybe there's something, if we knew this, or we could model this aspect a little bit better, it would give us that competitive edge. And if you do have your data and you go back and you back test it and so on, you can see that you can actually start to quantify that benefit.
Yeah, right. I think there's a Pascal quote about fortune favors a prepared mind. So I think that's probably what you're talking about here, is understanding the context. Great, Kevin. Thank you very much. Enrico, anything to add to those thoughts?
Well, maybe I'm a little bit more prescriptive, but I think that to move from raw data to decision making, you have to follow a number of steps that are both operational and strategic. So for instance, the first thing, you must extract data from all sources, all data sources. So the first strategic point is, from which sources do you want to extract data? Mm-hmm. The second is you want to do data cleansing and normalization, because if you want to use this data and match it or correlate it with other data, you want to make sure that you can compare apple with apples and sort of make sure that you can read the same data, although coming from, not the same data, but data can be comparable, and do the, for instance, a pattern analysis, but you want to make sure that you do it based on actually what is your business objective. So at this point, doing data cleansing, normalization, and enrichment, you have turned data into information, but then you have to distribute the information. Mm-hmm. So to whom? Who is authorized to read that information? Who's authorized to manage that data? And then how do you store it? So this comes back to the CTO, the roles that we said before. How do you store it, for how long? And then how do you maintain it? How do you update it? And last, when or how should you remove it? For how long should it be there?
Yeah.
So all these allow not only to transform data, raw data, into information, but also to make it useful to the company itself and to all the different stakeholders within the company.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, very close to our heart. We tend to make this distinction between data science and data engineering, where the engineering is around, you could argue, the plumbing and the architecture necessary to achieve what you are talking about. And the science might be about achieving the insights from that data. And we see organizations that have perhaps very good insights, but not necessarily good infrastructure to support the robust sharing of that information to maximize the value. So I think it's a really good point there. Thank you very much. I'm going to hop over to another question, which is a bit of a hybrid, but basically, I think we've agreed there's a lot of data. Some organizations have more, some have less, some are more mature, but broadly, there's a lot of data around inside or outside, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So the first part of this is, how can the CDO avoid the analysis paralysis? And Saeed, you came out with a very simple and elegant way of let's focus on the problem and build out from that iteratively, which I think does make sense. But we see a lot of organizations where there's just data everywhere and everyone's coming at them like, planes from the sky. So how do you avoid the analysis paralysis, given those often conflicting requests, requirements, priorities that change, not just on the front, the trading desk and the front office, but middle office and risk and other areas? And secondarily, can the CDO or the business perhaps run by the CDO be expected to monetize any of this? Saeed, why don't you kick off on that one?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, going back to my point, to try and solve some sort of simple use case to start with, just to show that there is value in kind of spending time and money on data, because ideally in any organization, you'd want to have a perfect data lake with every single bit of data in the firm there, access to external data to begin with. That's the ideal use case. But if that's going to take a year, 2 years to create, then you're not going to get anywhere. And by then, there's probably not going to be any budget basically for any data project. So to start with a use case, which hopefully you can strap relatively quickly. I would say in terms of monetization, there's several different ways. I was going to say you should read my book, but I will.
A shameless plug, but why not?
Sorry about that. But I think there's two aspects in terms of monetization. So one is to sell the data externally. This can be a bit of a hard sell for many organizations, because potentially you're giving up some sort of secrets of how your data is being run. And also it could be the case that it just doesn't move the needle for a large corporate anyway. The second way to monetize data is obviously internally. If you're, for example, you're trading or you're trying to streamline your operations, that's another way to monetize it. And then another way is basically in terms of as a marketing exercise. So do you have some sort of interesting data which could be released maybe on a monthly basis to the market, mm-hmm. where it would have your name associated with it every single month, and just try to boost your profile that way? So one example of that is ADP, a company which does payrolls in the US. They release a monthly number based on employment, based on their internal data. And they just get financial press every month for that. So there are several different ways to monetize it. It doesn't necessarily have to be you have to sell your data to funds, etc. It can also be through the marketing route as well.
Thanks. That's a really good set of distinctions. I guess in some degree we all see that the FT says X, or Coalition or someone else says Y, and that's a great way to monetize it, but indirectly, as opposed to, you know, here's a subscription model.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I think because in some instances they'll say, look, it's just not worth our while to try and sell data because we're a massive company and subscriptions are going to be maybe a couple of $1 million a year. So it's just another
not worth it. Okay, cool. Thank you. Jose, do you have any thoughts on this, particularly around the monetization part, but also maybe the analysis paralysis problem?
Yeah, on both. On the analysis paralysis, what I would say is, well, you need to be responsible, and there's going to be a CTO or a CEO on your back asking you for the information, or why I wasn't ready. And that takes us to the point that we were speaking at the beginning, that information given at the wrong time, or too late, or too raw is not information. It's just raw data, right? So on the analysis paralysis, definitely there has to be, in companies, there has to be a perfect alignment between the management and who's getting the information. And I see that even here at TradeFlow, when you're talking between the developers, the CEO, and everyone that is in the middle, there has to be a perfect understanding. What do we want? What information do we want? And when do you need it, right? Mm-hmm. So that helps to avoid the analysis paralysis. And then the other question would be, rather than monetizing, could a CDO or its department be responsible of a budget? Are you a profit center? Are you a cost center? We're looking at it as a cost center. And I think that at a certain point, you need to identify the revenue that valuable information brings to the company. Or what do you lose if you don't have that information? So at some point, you have to really allocate what is the value of that information, and that turns it into a profit center, right?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask one last question because we've only got a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask Enrico this question, which is, where do we go from here? What does a CDO function look like over the next 5 years?
Well, maybe 5 years is too a long shot, but I would say the role of the CDO would be to make him or herself useless. Let me say this better. So the role of the CDO is basically to inject into all the other C-levels that spirit and that understanding of how much data is important, how to use it, and how to leverage it. So it's, of course, so the role, the CDO's role today is to do that kind of job, to extract data and do all the things we've said. His or her job is to instill this into the others so that the CDO can really move to the next step, move to the next level of data monetization and making it strategic.
So sort of almost, you're talking about a sort of mentoring, guidance, kind of quasi-strategy role.
I mean, of course, I've been harsh. It's not that we don't need any more CDOs in the future. The point is that what the CDO is doing today, I think, should be part of the skill set of those who are at the C-level, have to make decisions. In terms, for instance, of helping the company understand what kind of digital or automation is needed for people to make decisions, so that the level of attention of data can move to the next level.
Right.
Very much operational.
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, I can't ask this question of the rest of the panel because we're running out of time. So just to recap, it seems to me that we've come to a fair conclusion around the roles of a CDO, a CTO, a CIO, and there are, I suppose, agreed upon distinctions, which is great. We think it is a vital role. It's got a kind of a mentoring aspect and a strategic aspect. There is plenty to learn from third parties. I think we all can see that. And it's a never-ending journey. There is no particular destination apart from, in Enrico's view, you make yourself redundant. But I suggest the function will probably continue to evolve. Maybe the title will change. But it's been really interesting, really fascinating. And I'm never going to gamble ever again based on what you told me, Kevin. Never was going to, but frankly, I'm never going to now. It's a losing straight. But thank you very much for your thoughts and input. I have really enjoyed it. I hope as an audience you've all enjoyed it.